Jim Rohn once told a room full of people something that sounds almost backwards. The richest people he ever studied didn't get there because they were smarter than everyone else. They got there because they understood one thing most of us never really learn: how to run our own day instead of letting our own day run us. That line has stuck with me for years. And the more I've watched people build businesses, careers, and lives, the more I think it's one of the most underrated ideas in all of personal development. We obsess over strategy, over hustle, over finding the next big opportunity, the next platform, the next shortcut. Meanwhile, the actual bottleneck in most people's lives isn't opportunity. It's what they do with their hours once they have it. Rohn wasn't a theorist. He came from almost nothing, spent years broke and directionless, and then spent decades studying the habits of people who built real wealth and real lives they were proud of. Somewhere in that process, he became convinced that the single most valuable skill separating people who thrive from people who just stay busy wasn't talent, and it wasn't luck. It was the management of time, specifically the wise use of it, alongside wisdom, knowledge, and resources more broadly. So today I want to walk through Jim Rohn's philosophy on time management, pulled directly from one of his seminars, and really sit with it instead of rushing through it for a highlight reel. We'll look at the 4 approaches he laid out, the essentials he considered non-negotiable, the personal story he told about nearly wrecking his own health, chasing success, and a couple of lines from that seminar that I think deserve to be framed on a wall somewhere. If you've ever felt busy all day and somehow gotten nowhere, if you've ever collapsed into a chair at the end of a long day, proud of how hard you worked, only to realize you can't actually point to what you accomplished, this one's for you. And if any of this lands as we go, drop a comment. I genuinely like seeing which parts hit home for different people, because it tells me a lot about where people are actually at right now, underneath the productivity advice noise everyone's drowning in. Let's get into it. Rohn didn't present time management as one single system you either follow or fail at. That's actually one of the more refreshing things about his approach compared to a lot of modern productivity content, which tends to hand you one rigid framework and insist it's the only correct way to live. Rohn laid out 4 different approaches to managing time, and the key insight, one that a lot of self-help content misses entirely, is that more than one of them can be valid, depending on what you actually want out of your life. The first approach is simply to ignore the subject on your own terms, not out of laziness, and not as an excuse to drift through life without direction. Rohn was adamant that nobody gets to hand you a definition of success and tell you to live inside it. His actual words were that success is the steady progress in reaching your own personal goals. Not a certain car, not a certain income bracket, not a title on a business card. Progress toward whatever you decided actually matters to you, at whatever pace you decided to move. He pushed this idea further than most speakers are willing to. He said, in essence, that if someone wanted to walk away from the conventional chase entirely, cash everything in, head for the mountains, live in a cabin, live off the land, and that person found genuine peace and satisfaction in that life, Rohn would call that a smashing success. Not a failure to launch, not someone who couldn't hack it. A success by the only definition that actually counts. Did you design the life you wanted? And did you make steady progress toward it? That's a strikingly generous definition of success from a man who spent his career teaching people how to build wealth. And I think that generosity is the whole point. Rohn wasn't interested in cloning himself into a room full of identical high achievers. He was interested in giving people permission to take his input, take everyone else's input, and then go build something that was actually theirs. Take the principles, take the experience other people offer you, let it inform your thinking, but don't let it design your life for you. That distinction between input and instruction is subtle, but it's everything. The second approach is scaling back. This one surprises people because it's not what you'd expect walking into a seminar about building wealth and managing time efficiently. Rohn told a story about a salesman who clawed his way up toward management, finally landed the big desk everyone in the office coveted, and then discovered the promotion came with roughly double the workload and about half the actual pay once you accounted for the hours. He'd gone from playing golf 3 days a week and living what Rohn described as a stress-free life to being buried. So the man stepped back down, on purpose, and return to the version of his career that actually worked for him. Rohn's point wasn't that ambition is bad, or that anyone reaching for more should quietly talk themselves out of it. It was that if a bigger commitment is quietly costing you your family, your health, or your peace of mind, scaling back isn't failure. It's a legitimate, deliberate time management decision. Arguably one of the hardest ones to make, because it runs against almost everything we're culturally trained to chase. Nobody throws a party when you turn down the promotion. But Rohn's framing was that if the math doesn't work for the life you actually want, walking it back is wisdom, not weakness. The third approach is the one most people default to without ever consciously choosing it. Work longer and harder. And Rohn didn't dismiss this option. He lived it in a very real and very costly way. He described his first year chasing a completely new income and a completely new future for himself after years of a life he was embarrassed by. He got so excited by the possibility of changing everything that he pushed past every reasonable limit. 12 hours a day, then 14, then 16, then 18, telling himself there were still 6 hours left over for sleep. So what was the harm? He was already a thin man his whole life. He joked that in high school, if he turned sideways, people would call him absent. But that year he lost over 20 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. He became, in his own words, a walking shadow. And it took him an uncomfortably long time to notice how far he'd pushed past sustainable, because he was so consumed by the momentum of finally moving towards something. It wasn't until it was genuinely starting to threaten his health that a single, simple question stopped him cold. What if he got rich and ended up too ill to actually spend it, or enjoy it, or live the life the money was supposed to build? That question was enough. He pulled back into something closer to a normal, sustainable workload. Working harder is valid, Rohn said. Genuinely valid, especially if you're currently coasting on far less effort than you're capable of giving. But it has an edge to it that's easy to miss while you're in the middle of the sprint. And that edge is worth respecting before you find it the hard way, the way he did. That story right there is worth sitting with for a second, because it's the part of the seminar most people skip past to get to the bullet point productivity tips. It's not a tip. It's a warning, delivered by someone who'd actually paid the price for ignoring it. We'll come back to what he built after that wake-up call. But first, there's a fourth approach, and it's the one that actually changes the math on everything else. The fourth approach is the one Rohn seemed to value most, and it's the one that separates his philosophy from a simple, just work harder mentality. Get more out of yourself. Not by adding more hours to an already full day, but by deliberately developing the skills that make your existing hours worth dramatically more. His example was simple, and it's aged remarkably well, even though he was describing a very different media landscape than the one we live in now. Talking to one person, one-on-one, teaches you exactly one person's worth of impact for that hour. Learning to communicate effectively to a room of 10 or 100 or 1,000 means the exact same hour of your life produces an entirely different scale of result. That's not about grinding harder. That's about the value packed into each hour changing shape entirely. He was honest about the trade-off, too, which is a detail a lot of people leave out when they retell this idea. Talking to one person at a time is more effective in a narrow sense. You can tailor the message, ask questions, get personal, adjust in real time to exactly what that individual needs. But it's far less efficient. Scaling up to a group sacrifices some of that personal precision in exchange for a much larger chain reaction of impact. Rohn wasn't saying one is simply better than the other. He was pointing out that understanding this trade-off and choosing deliberately where you want to operate on that spectrum is itself a skill worth developing. And this leads to what might be the single most quotable line from the entire seminar. Rohn said the real key to time management is simple to state and brutally hard to actually live by. You run the day, or it runs you. Sit with that for a second. Think about how much of modern life is quietly engineered to make that second option. The day running you. Feel completely normal, even inevitable. Notifications stacking up before you've had coffee. Other people's priorities landing in your inbox disguised as your own emergencies. An endless stream of things that feel urgent, most of which, on any honest inspection, are not actually important. Rohn was making this exact point decades before smartphones existed, And somehow the observation has only gotten sharper with time, not softer. He also drew a distinction that's easy to nod along to in the moment and genuinely hard to apply once you're back in your actual week. It's not the hours you put in that count. It's what you put into the hours. 12 hours of scattered, low-value, reactive effort will lose every single time against 3 or 4 hours of focused work aimed at something that actually matters. If you've ever finished a long, exhausting day and struggled to point to a single concrete thing you accomplished, that's usually not a discipline problem, and it's definitely not a laziness problem. It's a what went into the hours problem. And those two problems require completely different solutions. Sometimes just naming that difference clearly is enough to change how you plan tomorrow. If this is starting to reframe how you think about your own schedule, that's exactly the point of putting a video like this together. And if you're finding it useful, share it with someone who's always saying they're too busy, because there's a decent chance they need to hear the rest of this even more than the part you've already watched. Rohn didn't stop at philosophy and personal stories. He got specific about what he considered the actual, practical building blocks of managing time well. And it's a shorter, less complicated list than most modern productivity systems would have you believe you need. It starts with a written set of goals. Not goals floating around vaguely in your head, half remembered on your commute and forgotten by the time you sit down at your desk. Written. On paper, or at minimum somewhere you'll actually see and revisit. Not buried in a note you'll never reopen. Rohn treated this as the foundation everything else in the system sits on top of. Because without a written, specific set of goals, you have no real, objective way to tell the difference between something that deserves your time and something that just happens to be loud, urgent feeling, or emotionally demanding in the moment. From there, he emphasized constantly reviewing those goals. Not writing them once at the start of a year and filing them away, but returning to them regularly, checking whether your actual daily behavior lines up with what you claimed mattered to you. That gap between the goals we write down and the way we actually spend a Tuesday afternoon is where most people's time quietly leaks away without them ever noticing. Then comes arranging those goals in priority. This sounds obvious, stated out loud, and it's shockingly rare in practice. Most people treat every item on their to-do list as roughly equally important, which functionally means nothing is prioritized at all. Rohn's version of this was simpler and more useful, separating majors from minors. A major conversation, a major decision, a major relationship gets your full, undivided attention and whatever time it genuinely requires. A minor one doesn't need that same weight, and pretending it does is one of the most common and least noticed ways people waste an entire day. He gave a very concrete example of this that's easy to apply immediately. Before you pick up the phone or before you agree to a meeting, ask yourself honestly whether this is a major call or a minor one. Is this a casual, informal gathering or a formal one that could genuinely shape your future? If it's informal and low stakes, it doesn't deserve heavy preparation or anxious overthinking. If it's going to have a real effect on where your life or your business goes, it deserves real time and real focus. The mistake most people make, according to Rohn, is spending major time on minor things, and only minor, scattered attention on the handful of conversations and decisions that actually shape their future. And then wondering, months or years later, why nothing seems to be moving. Alongside this, he talked about the necessity of a genuine plan to achieve those goals. Not just the goals themselves sitting on a page looking aspirational. A goal without a plan is just a wish with a deadline attached. Whether it's a plan to grow a business, to build an organization, or to expand into new territory, Rohn was insistent that the plan itself deserves real thought and real time. Not because planning is glamorous, but because it's the piece that actually connects the goal you wrote down to the day you're about to live tomorrow. Then there's a line from the same section of the seminar that I think is the most quietly devastating idea in the whole talk. Don't mistake movement for achievement. Rohn described watching people, including versions of himself in earlier years, come home every night completely exhausted, collapsing into a chair, genuinely proud of how busy they'd been all day. And he'd ask the only question that actually matters in that moment. Busy doing what? Motion isn't the same thing as progress. Some people, in his words, are busy all day, but essentially running figure eights. A huge amount of activity, very little actual advancement toward anything they'd claim to care about. That distinction alone, taken seriously, would change how most of us plan our weeks. It's not about doing more. It's about being honest with yourself about whether what you're doing is actually moving you anywhere, or just making you tired in a way that feels productive because it's exhausting. Beyond goals and priorities, Rohn rounded out his system with a handful of habits that sound almost too simple to matter, until you actually try to live by all of them consistently for a month and realize how demanding that simplicity actually is. The first is concentration. Zero in on whatever's directly in front of you. Rohn drew a comparison to sports here that stuck with a lot of people who've heard this seminar. In competitive sports, a single moment of lost concentration, and the game is essentially over. The opportunity is gone. You have to wait for another chance. He argued that the same principle applies to how we spend our working hours. Split attention, constantly divided between 6 half-finished things, produces a fraction of the result that focused attention on one thing produces. This isn't really a time management tip so much as it's an attention management tip. And Rohn seemed to understand, long before it became a common talking point, that attention and time aren't actually the same resource. Next is learning to say no. And specifically, learning to say no early, before you've overcommitted, rather than scrambling to walk it back later after you've already agreed to something you shouldn't have. He pointed out how easy it is, in a social culture built around agreeableness, to say yes, yes, yes too quickly, and then spend a disproportionate amount of energy later trying to gracefully back out of commitments you never should have made in the first place. One of his colleagues had a phrase for this that's blunt but memorable. Don't let your mouth overload your back. Obligating yourself too quickly, to too much, too soon, is one of the most common and most avoidable ways people end up with schedules that don't remotely reflect their actual priorities. His suggested alternative was simple. When you're not sure, say you're not sure, rather than committing on the spot out of social pressure. Tell people you'll call back if your answer changes. That small shift from an automatic yes to an honest maybe protects far more time than most people realize, because it removes the need for all the awkward walking back conversations that eat up energy later. Then there's a boundary that's gotten harder to maintain in the modern world than it was when Rohn first taught this, but which he considered essential. When you work, work. And when you play, play. Don't blend the two into a mediocre version of both. Part of this, he said, is removing distractions from the work environment itself wherever you reasonably can, so that the boundary isn't something you have to enforce through sheer willpower every 5 minutes. It's built into the environment you've set up around yourself. And finally, he emphasized honest self-analysis. Look clearly at what you're genuinely good at, and look for ways to expand and lean into that. Look equally clearly at what you're not good at. And if you're not going to personally develop that skill, find a way to get it covered by someone else, rather than continuing to sink disproportionate time into something you're never going to be efficient at. All of this circles back to the phrase Rohn kept returning to throughout the seminar. Stay in charge of your day. He was honest that this isn't a one-time decision you make and then coast on forever. Sometimes you start a project fully in control of it, fully driving the schedule. And then, almost without noticing the transition, the project is in charge of you. And you're the one being run around by something you originally set in motion. The goal isn't to achieve some permanent, effortless state of control. It's to keep checking, regularly and honestly, whether you're still the one steering or whether something else has quietly taken the wheel. If any part of this section is making you think about a specific commitment sitting on your plate right now that you agreed to too fast, that's worth paying attention to. That instinct is usually right. It's one thing to nod along to a seminar and quite another to actually rebuild your Monday morning around it. So let's get concrete for a minute about what taking Rohn seriously might look like in practice, because I think that's where most of this kind of content quietly falls apart. People hear the ideas, agree with them completely in the moment, and then go back to exactly the same week they were living before, because nobody ever translated the philosophy into an actual decision they could make at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. Start with the written goals, because everything else in his system depends on that foundation being real instead of theoretical. Not a vague sense of, I'd like to do better this year, but something specific enough that you could look at any given hour of your week and honestly say whether it moved you toward that goal or away from it. Rohn's insistence on writing things down wasn't sentimental. It was functional. A goal that only exists in your head is infinitely negotiable the moment something more comfortable or more urgent feeling shows up. A goal that's written down and that you've actually looked at recently has a kind of gravity that a vague intention never will. Once that's in place, the majors versus minors filter becomes something you can actually use in real time, rather than an abstract idea you agree with but never apply. Before you say yes to a meeting, a call, a favor, a project, you have an actual reference point to check it against. Does this move me towards something I wrote down as mattering? Or is this simply the loudest thing asking for my attention this week? That single question, asked honestly and consistently, quietly reshapes a calendar over the course of a few months in a way that no amount of willpower alone ever manages to. Then there's the harder, more emotionally loaded piece. The choice between Rohn's third and fourth approaches, working harder versus working smarter through developed skill. Most people treat this as an either-or, and I don't think Rohn intended it that way. There's likely a season in most ambitious lives where genuinely putting in more hours than feels comfortable is the honest, necessary thing to do. Building something new rarely happens on a leisurely, well-rested schedule. But Rohn's own story is the built-in warning label on that season. It has an edge, and it's easy to miss the edge while you're inside the momentum of it. The discipline isn't just working hard. It's periodically stepping back and honestly checking whether the hard work is still sustainable or whether it's quietly costing you something you'll regret losing. And running underneath both of those is the fourth approach, the one Rohn seemed to circle back to most, deliberately building skill so that the same hour produces more. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the one modern audiences are most likely to skip past in favor of hustle culture's simpler, louder message of just doing more. Rohn wasn't anti-effort. He was pointing out that effort without increasing skill hits a ceiling fast, while effort paired with deliberately expanding capability compounds. An hour spent this year, with a more developed set of skills than you had last year, is worth more than the same hour was worth 12 months ago. Not because you tried harder in the moment, but because of everything you built in between. Here's what I keep coming back to, the more time I spend with this particular seminar. Jim Rohn wasn't handing out a productivity hack, and he wasn't selling a rigid 12-step system designed to make everyone in the room operate identically. He was making a much bigger argument, and it's an argument about ownership. The biggest lever in your life isn't more time, because that part isn't actually up for negotiation. Everyone gets the same 24 hours, rich or broke, ambitious or content, no exceptions. The lever, the only one that's actually available to you, is deciding, deliberately and repeatedly, what goes into those hours. And refusing to let other people's priorities quietly become your own by default, simply because you never took the time to write down what your own priorities actually were. Whether that means working harder for a defined season the way he did during that first grueling year, or scaling back deliberately the way the salesman in his story eventually did, or spending real, sustained effort developing the specific skills that make your existing time worth more. The through line running underneath all four of his approaches is the same. You run the day, or it runs you. There's no version of a genuinely well-lived life where that particular choice gets quietly made for you by inertia, by other people's expectations, or by whatever happens to be loudest in your inbox that morning. It's also worth noticing what Rohn didn't say. He didn't say ambition is bad. He didn't say you have to grind yourself into the ground to prove you're serious. He didn't say the only valid path is relentless expansion. He genuinely believed a person who walked away from the conventional chase to live a smaller, quieter, more deliberate life, and actually meant it, actually built that on purpose, was just as much a success as someone who built an empire. The common thread wasn't the size of what you built. It was whether you built it on purpose, with your eyes open, instead of drifting into whatever life happened around you. That's a genuinely rare thing to hear from someone teaching a seminar about productivity and time management. Most of that space is built around one narrow definition of winning. Rohn's version left room for an honest answer, whatever that honest answer happened to be for the person listening. There's one more thread worth pulling on before we close, because I think it's the part of this seminar that ages the best. Rohn was speaking to a room of people decades ago, long before constant connectivity turned staying in charge of your day into something closer to a full-time job in itself. And yet almost nothing in his framework needs updating for right now. The written goals, the majors versus minors filter, the refusal to mistake movement for achievement, the honest self-analysis of what you're actually good at. None of that depends on the specific tools or distractions of any particular decade. It depends on a decision, made and remade, about whether you're the one steering. If anything, the case for taking this seriously is stronger now than it was when he first taught it. The forces competing for your attention today are more numerous, more sophisticated, and more relentless than anything Rohn was describing to that room, which means the skill he was pointing at, deciding deliberately what goes into your hours instead of absorbing whatever shows up loudest, isn't a nice to have anymore. It's closer to a survival skill for anyone who wants their week to actually reflect what they claim matters to them. So if you take one thing away from this breakdown, let it be the question Rohn kept returning to in different forms throughout the whole seminar. Not how busy was I today, but what did I actually put into today? That's the question that separates motion from progress. And it's the one worth asking yourself honestly before the day even starts, not just after it's already gone. If this changed even slightly how you're thinking about your own week, that's exactly why I put videos like this together. Breaking down the ideas that actually hold up under real scrutiny, instead of just the ones that sound good for 15 seconds and evaporate by the time you close the app. If you found this useful, subscribe and turn on notifications so the next one lands when it's ready. And if a specific part of this resonated with you, say which one in the comments. I read all of them, and it genuinely shapes what I cover next. Thanks for spending this time with me. Now go use the rest of yours well.